The smell of burned cedar was still strong in the air when the Babylonian soldiers dragged the last princes of Judah out of the city, leaving behind a trail of ashes where there had once been glory. What seemed to be the definitive end of a nation was, in fact, the terrifying fulfillment of a countdown that had been ignored for decades. A prophet named Jeremiah had already warned, it would not be an eternal massacre, but a surgical period of 70 years. And that number was not chosen by chance. It was a spiritual debt collection, 1 year of imprisonment for every year that the land had not rested. As they walked, shackled through the desert, they did not know, but they were carrying in their pocket the return passage, dated for exactly 7 decades in the future. What happened in the meantime, between the impenetrable walls of Babylon and the silence of exile, was not just a punishment, it was the greatest operation of rescue of a people's identity that history has ever seen. And it all started with a prophecy that no one believed until the first brick of the temple fell. Jerusalem lived a dangerous illusion, intoxicated by a sense of security that did not correspond to the spiritual reality of its people. A scenario where the smell of incense mixed with the moral decay of a nation that had turned its back on its creator. It was in this environment of false peace that the solitary and anguished voice of a man echoed through the stone streets, bringing a warning that no one wanted to hear. As recorded in the book of Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 11, where the prophet openly declared that all that land would become a desolation and a horror, and that those nations would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. It was not merely a political or military forecast, but a divine decree born of decades of exhausted patience, where God, in his mercy, sent messenger after messenger, rising early and speaking, as we read in the ancient chronicles. But the people mocked those men, despised the words, and insulted the prophets. The city was full of rituals. The Temple of Solomon still shone under the Middle Eastern sun like an architectural jewel, and this created in the minds of the leaders and the people a magical belief that, by possessing the house of God, they were immune to any catastrophe, forgetting that the presence of God does not dwell amidst stubborn disobedience. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, did not weep out of weakness, but because he saw what no one else saw, the shadow of an unrelenting empire marching toward them, while corrupt priests preached that everything would be fine, numbing the collective conscience and pushing the nation toward an irreversible abyss. What was happening within the heart of that people is a frightening mirror of human nature when it decides to ignore the clear warnings from heaven, preferring to believe comforting lies rather than facing painful truths that demand a change of life. They lived a religiosity of appearance, mixed with everything that the pagan nations around practiced, adopting customs that God abhorred while maintaining the temple's liturgy functioning perfectly, creating a spiritual schizophrenia that made them deaf to the voice of God. But then the unexpected happens. The prophet does not stop speaking even when thrown into cisterns, imprisoned and beaten, because the word inside him was like a fire that could not be contained, and he knew that the Chaldean army was not merely an expanding military force, but the very rod of God's anger raised against a broken covenant. The elite of Judah, the kings who succeeded one another on the throne of David, looked to the political horizon and tried to make alliances with Egypt, believing that human diplomacy could save them from divine judgment, a futile attempt to solve, in the natural realm, a problem that was entirely spiritual. The blindness was so profound that even when the enemy armies began to appear at the borders, the population continued their empty feasts and sacrifices, convinced that God was obliged to protect them because of their past traditions, not realizing that divine protection is for those who walk in covenant, and not for those who use the name of the Lord as a lucky charm. The tragedy of Judah was not the lack of warning, but the excess of pride that hardened the neck of that generation, transforming what could have been a moment of national repentance into a countdown to total destruction. Jeremiah's message was clear and specific, leaving no room for doubt about the duration of the punishment or the identity of the invader, which eliminated any excuse of ignorance on the part of the listeners. Each day that passed without knees bending in repentance was one more day sealing the fate of those millennia-old walls, and the tension in the air became unbearable for those who had spiritual discernment, while the majority continued living as if tomorrow were guaranteed. The prophet warned that the cup of wrath was full and about to overflow, and that Babylon, led by a king whom God called my servant to accomplish this task, would come not only to conquer lands, but to purify the land of sin through fire and exile. And then, what seemed impossible to the eyes of that arrogant people began to unfold on the horizon. The dust raised by the Babylonian war chariots began to be seen from afar, signaling that the time of grace had ended and the time of severe discipline had come, bringing with it a reality that would forever change the identity of that chosen people. When Nebuchadnezzar first arrived at the gates of Jerusalem in the year of 605 before Christ, he did not come with the immediate intention of leveling the city to the ground, but with a much more subtle and dangerous strategy. He wanted to steal the future of the nation by kidnapping its brightest minds. The biblical account in Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, shows us that the king ordered Aspenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without physical defect, handsome, instructed in all wisdom, knowledgeable in knowledge, and competent to serve in the king's palace. This maneuver revealed that Babylon did not want merely slave bodies to carry stones, but desired to absorb the intelligence, culture, and leadership potential of Judah, incorporating them into its own empire to strengthen it. It was a surgical strike at the heart of Jewish hope. For by carrying off young princes and intellectuals, Nebuchadnezzar decapitated the future leadership of Israel, leaving behind a more vulnerable population less capable of organizing effective resistance. Imagine the painful scene of those young men, perhaps still teenagers, being torn from their mother's arms and the safety of their homes, forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward a land they only knew through horror stories, carrying not only the pain of separation, but the weight of being bearers of faith in a completely hostile environment. Upon arriving in Babylon, these young men encountered a metropolis that was the center of the known world, with its hanging gardens, gigantic temples dedicated to Marduk, and an architecture that shouted power and human glory, designed to make any Hebrew feel small and their God seem insignificant. The Babylonian plan was a deliberate attempt to undo the spiritual identity of these young men, changing their names, which contained references to the God of Israel for names that exalted pagan deities, and imposing a diet and education aimed at reprogramming the way they saw the world and themselves. It was not merely a geographical change, but an immense cultural pressure for them to mix with everything, accepting that the truth of Jehovah was just one among many, and that in order to survive and prosper in the court, they would need to abandon the rigid principles of the law of Moses. But God had not yet said the last word in the lives of these exiles, for even in the heart of that idolatrous and oppressive culture, He preserved a faithful remnant that refused to be contaminated, demonstrating that faithfulness does not depend on where we are, but on who we are inside. The battle fought in those Babylonian classrooms and the palace dining halls was as intense as any military siege. For what was at stake was not the possession of a territory, but the soul and integrity of the faith that would one day bring the Messiah into the world. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King Jehoiakim and the rest of the people who stayed behind breathed a sigh of relief, thinking naively that the worst was over, and that by handing over the temple treasures and the noble hostages, they had purchased definitive peace with the northern giant. This false sense of security led the nation to continue on its twisted paths, not understanding that that first wave of exiles was merely the prelude to a much greater catastrophe being prepared behind the scenes of divine history. The city was weakened, without its best counselors and administrators, now ruled by men who lacked the vision and character necessary to guide the people in such turbulent times, becoming political puppets that wavered between submission to Babylon and the temptation to rebel with the support of Egypt. What they did not realize was that God was moving the pieces of the board in a sovereign way, using the exile of those young men as a seed of preservation, sending ahead those who would keep the law and wisdom for a future return. While the rebellious city was moving rapidly toward its final judgment, the departure of Daniel and his friends left a vacuum in Jerusalem, but planted a light in Babylon, a light that would shine in the darkness of paganism and prove that the God of Israel was not limited to the borders of Canaan. The years passed, and Babylon's patience with the constant revolts of Judah came to an end, resulting in the return of Nebuchadnezzar's army, but this time not to negotiate or take hostages, but to annihilate the existence of Jerusalem as a fortified city. As described in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 to 3, in the 9th year of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against Jerusalem with all his army, encamped against it, and raised siege works around it, starting a siege that would last about 18 months of pure agony and terror. The walls that were once a source of pride became the bars of a deadly prison, where no one entered and no one left, and the food supply began to dwindle day by day, turning the holy city into a nightmare scene where human dignity was undone by extreme hunger. The biblical account and the laments of Jeremiah paint a horrifying picture, where the skin of the people darkened like an oven due to the fever of hunger, and the nursing children fainted in the streets, asking for bread and wine from their mothers who had nothing to give, revealing the level of despair to which those who trusted in their own strength and despised God's protection had come. Inside the walls, the situation reached levels of barbarity that are hard to imagine, with society collapsing completely as the rich and the poor became equal in the misery of starvation, and terrible reports indicate that compassion disappeared to the point that mothers, in their hunger delirium, cooked their own children to survive. And it is here that the story becomes even darker. King Zedekiah, the one who should have been the shepherd of the people and lead them to repentance, showed his supreme cowardice by trying to flee in the middle of the night through a breach in the walls, abandoning his people to their own fate at the most critical moment. This desperate flight was not just an act of fear, but the culmination of a leadership that never trusted in God, trying to escape divine judgment by running through the plains of Jericho, not realizing that there is no place on earth where one can hide from justice when it has been decreed from the heavens. The city, now without a king and without defense, saw its walls breached by the Babylonian battering rams, and the invading army flooded the streets like a wave of destruction, mercilessly cutting down young men, old men, and maidens, fulfilling every prophetic word that had been spoken years before and scorned. The capture of Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho was the humiliating end of the monarchy of Judah, where he was brought before Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah to be judged, not as a sovereign king, but as a treacherous vassal who broke his oath. The sentence given to him was one of calculated cruelty to be the last image that his eyes would see. His sons were beheaded before him, and shortly after his eyes were gouged out, ensuring that the memory of the death of his lineage would be the perpetual darkness that would accompany him for the rest of his days in Babylonian prison. Jerusalem had fallen, its defenders dead or captured, and the silence of death replaced the noise of festivities as the Chaldean army prepared for the final act of desecration. Famine, plague, and the sword had done their terrible work, and what remained of the population was stunned, too weak to fight and too shocked to cry, watching everything they had built and loved be reduced to nothing because of a stubborn heart that refused to listen to the voice of God. The fall of Jerusalem was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of a world, the end of an era, and the painful demonstration that God has no commitment to structures or traditions, but to the faithfulness and obedience of his people. The day that smoke rose from Mount Moriah was not just a military event, but the most traumatic moment in Israel's ancient history, marking the instant when the visible presence of God seemed to have abandoned the earth forever. The account in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 8 and 9, tells us that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard and servant of the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem with a clear mission: to erase the memory of the God of Israel from the face of the earth. He did not come just to plunder, but to deconstruct the soul of the nation, setting fire to the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the important houses of Jerusalem, turning centuries of sacred history into ashes and rubble in a matter of hours. Imagine the horror in the eyes of the priests and the remaining people as they saw the flames licking the beams of cedar from Lebanon, those same woods that Solomon had brought with such cost and reverence, and watched the gold that covered the walls melt like wax, dripping down the stones, blackened by fire. The temple was not just a building, it was their theological guarantee, the place where heaven touched earth, and to see it burn was like watching the death of hope itself, a terrible visual confirmation that the covenant had been broken, and that God, in his holiness, would no longer dwell in the midst of a people with impure hearts. The smell of burnt wood, mixed with the blood of the Levites massacred in the courtyard, created a nightmare atmosphere, where God's silence in the face of the profanation of his sanctuary shouted louder than any thunder, teaching the harsh lesson that the Lord does not protect stones and rituals when the essence of worship has been corrupted by idolatry. The destruction was meticulous and full of spiritual symbolism. As the Babylonians did not content themselves with burning the structure, they dismantled the sacred objects that represented the mediation between God and man. The great bronze pillars, Yikin and Boaz, which stood at the entrance of the temple and symbolized God's stability and strength, were broken into pieces and taken as scrap to Babylon, a clear sign that Israel's strength had been removed and its stability undone. The sea of bronze, the brazen utensils, the shovels, and all the items used in the sacred service were looted, not for their spiritual value, but for the weight of the metal, reducing the sacred to the profane, treating the things of God as common spoils of war. But then the unexpected happens. While the physical temple was being destroyed, God's true glory was no longer there long ago, as the prophet Ezekiel had seen in his visions, where the glory of the Lord rose and left the city because of the abominations committed there. The real tragedy was not the Babylonian fire, but the spiritual void that preceded it. The burning temple was merely an empty shell, a monument to a dead religion that maintained the appearance of piety without the power of holiness. The pain of that moment was the pain of a divine divorce, where God handed his unfaithful wife over to her cruel lovers, allowing the object of his national pride to be reduced to dust so that perhaps, in the midst of the ashes, a contrite heart could finally be born. That fire marked the end of an era and the beginning of a time of darkness where the question, "Where is your God?" would echo in the mind of every survivor. There was no more daily sacrifice, no more incense smoke rising to atone for sins, and the most holy place, where only the high priest entered once a year, was now exposed to the sun and the impious gazes of the Gentile soldiers who mocked the Hebrew faith. The city of David, the joy of all the earth, became a mound of smoking ruins, now inhabited only by jackals and the silence of death. As the survivors looked back one last time, seeing the column of smoke rise not as the glory of Shekinah, but as a sign of completed judgment. It was a brutal shock of reality, undoing the popular theology that the temple of the Lord was an indestructible amulet, and forcing the people to face the naked truth. God prefers not to have a house on earth than to dwell in a house full of idols and injustice. The glory has departed. Ichabod was spiritually written on the burned doors of Jerusalem, and the people who prided themselves on being the light of the nations were now about to plunge into the deep darkness of captivity, taking with them only the painful memory of what they had lost for not listening to the prophets that God, in his tireless love, had sent. The journey to Babylon was not a simple relocation of inhabitants, but a march of death, a collective Calvary of nearly 1,500 kilometers that tested the physical and spiritual limits of every man, woman, and child of Judah. As described in the prophetic laments and in the historical context of Jeremiah chapter 52, the people were taken not as free citizens, but as cattle, chained to one another, dragged out of the land that God had promised to their ancestors, forced to walk towards the cradle of idolatry that their ancestors, like Abraham, had left behind centuries before. It was a tragic inversion of the Exodus. Instead of leaving slavery for the promised land with hands full of riches, they were leaving the promised land for slavery with empty hands and bodies marked by hunger and war. The road through the Fertile Crescent was arduous under the scorching sun of the Syrian desert, where thirst was a constant companion, and physical weakness became a death sentence for the elderly and the sick who could not keep up with the pace imposed by the Chaldean soldiers. The brutality of this march served as a cruel sieve, eliminating the weakest and leaving only those resilient enough to serve the empire, while the roads were marked by the shallow graves of those who fell along the way, denied a dignified burial, left behind as silent witnesses to the tragedy of a nation. The psychological and emotional suffering was even more devastating than the physical pain of the chains and wounds on their feet, for every step they took away from Jerusalem was a blow to the soul, a tearing apart from everything that defined their identity. Imagine the anguish of parents trying to protect their children from the cruelty of the guards with no bread to give, seeing the fear in the eyes of the little ones who did not understand why the God they had heard so much about was not saving them. Humiliation was constant. They, the chosen people, the apple of God's eye, were now a subject of ridicule for the nations through which they passed, exposed to public shame, treated like the scum of the earth. What may have happened within their hearts during those months of walking was a mixture of revolt, guilt, and a deep despair, questioning whether God had nullified his covenant forever or if there was any hope beyond that dusty horizon. The forced march unraveled any remnants of human pride. There was no king to defend them, no prophet to promise immediate deliverance, only the raw reality of the chains clanking with every step, reminding them every second that the wages of sin are harsh and that disobedience has a price that must be paid sooner or later. But God had not yet said the last word about the fate of that people. For even in that line of miserable prisoners, the seed of preservation was being kept, and faith began to be purified in the furnace of affliction. While the bodies suffered, the minds were forced to reflect on the words of Jeremiah and the other prophets, and many began to realize that this was not a historical accident, but the exact fulfillment of what had been warned. The march of the chains ironically became the beginning of a process of spiritual healing, where idolatry began to lose its charm in the face of the harsh reality of judgment. They were going to Babylon physically defeated, but it was necessary for them to lose the land so that one day they could find the Lord of the land again. With each kilometer traveled, Jerusalem grew more distant, becoming a memory and a dream, while the imposing and threatening shadow of Babylon grew on the horizon, ready to swallow them. They would arrive not as conquerors, but as broken-hearted individuals, ready to learn through tears and longing the lessons that prosperity and peace had never managed to teach, preparing the ground so that 70 years later, a transformed remnant could make the journey back. The arrival in Babylon was a cultural and visual shock of biblical proportions, throwing the exhausted Jews into a world that seemed designed to intimidate and seduce, a metropolis that pulsed with a power and a wealth that Jerusalem had never known. Upon passing through the immense gates of Ishtar, with their blue-glazed bricks and reliefs of dragons and bulls, the exiles felt like ants before giants, confronted with the grandeur of an empire that worshipped human strength and strange deities. Psalm 137, verses 1 to 4, perfectly captures the raw pain of this moment, describing how they sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept as they remembered Zion, hanging their harps on the willows because they could not find the strength to sing the songs of the Lord in a strange land. That stunning landscape, with the famous hanging gardens that seemed to defy gravity and the ziggurats that scratched the sky, served as a daily reminder of their defeat and the apparent superiority of the Babylonian gods over the God of Israel. They were now an insignificant minority, surrounded by a language they did not understand and customs that offended their faith, living under the shadow of a civilization that celebrated everything that the law of Moses condemned, creating a profound identity crisis. How to continue being the people of God when the place of God, the temple, no longer existed and the Holy Land was far away. Contrary to what many imagine, captivity did not mean that everyone was locked up in dark dungeons. The Babylonian strategy was more subtle, allowing the exiles to live in their own settlements, like Tel Aviv, near the river Shebar, where they could build houses, plant gardens, and start families, according to the surprising instruction of Jeremiah in the letter sent to the exiles. This watched freedom was in fact a dangerous test, as the temptation to settle down and mix with the local culture was immense, offering a life of comfort and prosperity in exchange for the forgetting of their spiritual roots. Life in Babylon presented commercial opportunities and social advancement that did not exist in small Judah. And the real danger was not violent persecution, but a slow and silent assimilation, the risk of becoming Babylonians in practice, keeping the faith only as a folklore tradition of the past. It was in this environment, mixed with everything, that the urgent need to preserve the word was born. Without the temple, and without sacrifices, the people had to turn to the study of the Torah and meet in small groups, giving rise to what we now know as the synagogue system. The absence of ritual forced the emergence of a faith based on teaching and prayer, transforming Hebrew religion from something centered in a place to something centered in the heart and the book, a fundamental change that would ensure the survival of Judaism. What happens in Babylon changes everything in the internal structure of the people of God, for there, in the midst of rampant idolatry, they were forced to choose who they would serve in a way they never had to in Jerusalem. The pressure to worship Marduk and participate in impure feasts was constant, but it was precisely this pressure that forged a new identity in many, separating the wheat from the chaff, the true faithful from those who were Jews only in name. While some got lost in the charms of the great city, forgetting Jerusalem and adopting pagan customs, a faithful core resisted, keeping alive the flame of messianic hope and passing on to their children the promise that this exile had an end date. They lived in Babylon, worked for the city's peace as the prophet commanded, but did not belong to Babylon. Their bodies were there, but their hearts were turned towards the ruins of Zion, awaiting the appointed time. This tension between living in the world without being of the world became the hallmark of faith in exile, a precious lesson that the people of God can thrive even in hostile soil, as long as their roots are deep in the unshakable promise of the Lord, and not in the passing circumstances of an empire that, no matter how powerful it seemed, was destined to fall before the eternal God. Life in Babylon was not merely a matter of physical survival, but a constant spiritual battleground where loyalty to God was tested under the threat of imminent death. As narrated in the book of Daniel chapter 3, the tension reached its peak in the plain of Dura, where a colossal statue of gold, measuring 60 cubits in height, was erected as the supreme symbol of human glory and the divinity of the state. The order was simple and terrifying. To the sound of music, everyone was to bow down and worship or face the burning fiery furnace. Imagine the loneliness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at that moment. 3 men amidst a crowd of thousands, prostrating with their faces to the ground, standing firm like unshakable pillars of a faith that would not sell out. The silence that followed their refusal must have been deafening, only broken by the furious accusations of the Chaldeans, who saw in that disobedience not just a religious act, but an unforgivable political betrayal. King Nebuchadnezzar, accustomed to having his desires met instantly, was seized by uncontrollable fury, giving the young men one last chance, which was in fact a trap for their souls. Deny God to save your skin. But their response echoes through the centuries with supernatural courage. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. But if not, let it be known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods. This declaration was not bravado, but proof that true faith does not depend on favorable circumstances, but on the certainty of who God is, even in the face of the scorching heat of a furnace, heated 7 times more. The scene that unfolds next defies all human logic and the laws of physics, for when the 3 young men were thrown bound into the midst of the fire, the expectation was to see bodies consumed instantly, turned to ash by the violence of flames that even killed the soldiers who pushed them. But then the unexpected happens. The king, looking into the furnace, sees not destruction but freedom. He sees 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire without suffering any harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. The presence of God did not deliver them from the furnace, but delivered them in the furnace, transforming the place of death into a sanctuary of glory, where the Lord himself descended to walk with his faithful servants. The fire had power only to burn the ropes that bound them, but did not touch a hair on their heads or leave the smell of smoke on their clothes. This miracle shook the theological foundations of Babylon, forcing the most powerful emperor in the world to acknowledge that there is no other God who can deliver like this. The resilience of the spirit of these men proved that faithfulness to God is the most powerful weapon against cultural tyranny. And when the people of God decide not to mingle with sin, heaven moves to honor that decision before the eyes of the unbelievers. Decades later, this same resistance was proven again, not in fire, but in the darkness of a den full of hungry lions under the reign of Darius, showing that the battle for integrity lasts a lifetime. Daniel, now elderly, became the target of envy from the satraps, who found no fault or corruption in him, except for his unwavering devotion to the law of his God. The cunning plot to prohibit prayers to any god or man except the king aimed to hit Daniel's strongest point, his daily communion with the Lord. And it is here that the story becomes even darker. For Daniel, knowing that the decree had been signed, did not hide or change his routine. He went up to his room, opened the windows toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day, as he had done previously. He chose the lion's den rather than silence his faith, preferring to be torn apart by beasts than to have his soul corrupted by the fear of men. The night that the king spent awake, fasting and unable to sleep, contrasted with the supernatural peace that Daniel experienced down below, where God sent his angel to shut the mouths of the lions. In the morning, the calm voice of the prophet responding to the anguished king was the final proof that the God of Israel reigns sovereign over kings and beasts, and that those who trust in him will never be confounded, serving as an eternal testimony that true authority is not on the throne of Babylon or Persia, but on the throne of the Most High. At the height of his power, Nebuchadnezzar seemed untouchable, a monarch whose word was law, and whose glory extended from Egypt to the borders of the east. But there was an enemy he could not conquer, the pride that grew like a cancer in his heart. The astonishing account of Daniel chapter 4 shows us a king disturbed by a dream that none of his wise men could interpret, a dream about a gigantic tree that reached to the heavens, visible to all the earth, that provided food and shade for all, but which was cut down by the order of a holy watcher, leaving only the stump with the roots in the ground. Daniel, with the painful honesty of a true prophet, revealed that the tree was the king himself, who had grown and become strong, but the decree of the Most High determined that he would be driven away from men and live with the beasts of the field, until he acknowledged that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he wills. It was a clear warning, an urgent call to repentance, where Daniel advised the king to break off his sins by being righteous and his iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in the hope that his prosperity might be prolonged. However, time passed, 12 months went by, and the human heart, prone to forget God in times of prosperity, hardened again, leading the king to walk on the roof of the royal palace, admiring the work of his hands and claiming for himself a glory that belonged only to the Creator. The divine response to Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance was immediate and terrifying, cutting off his boastfulness at the very moment the words were leaving his mouth. "Is not this the great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling, with the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" While the king was still speaking, a voice fell from heaven, announcing that the kingdom had departed from him, and at that very hour his sanity, which he so valued, was taken from him, plunging him into a deep, animalistic, mental darkness. He was driven from human society, exchanging royal banquets for the grass of the field, eating grass like cattle, his body wet with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. This humiliating condition, known as clinical lycanthropy or boanthropy, was a shocking visual demonstration that man, no matter how powerful without God, is reduced to the most basic instincts and loses the dignity conferred upon him. The throne was empty, the counselors were bewildered, and great Babylon saw its builder crawling on the earth, stripped of his majesty, proving that God resists the proud, and that no human empire is secure when its leader rises against heaven. But God had not yet said the last word in the life of this pagan king, for the judgment was not for final destruction, but for correction and revelation. At the end of those 7 times, something extraordinary happened. Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes to heaven, a simple gesture that marked the return of his understanding and the beginning of his restoration. He did not return to the throne with the same arrogance as before, but with praise on his lips, blessing the Most High and acknowledging that God does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and that no one can stay his hand. That proud king was broken and remade, transformed from a self-centered tyrant into a worldwide witness to the power of God, even going so far as to write a decree for all peoples, nations, and languages, recounting his signs and wonders. The lesson learned in the fields, eating bitter herbs, was more valuable than all the wisdom acquired in the palaces, teaching Nebuchadnezzar and all of us that true greatness is not in building empires that turn to dust, but in humbling oneself before him whose kingdom is from generation to generation. The story of this king serves as a solemn warning and a bright hope. Pride precedes a fall, but sincere repentance opens the doors to restoration, even for those who seem beyond all hope. Time passed, and the lesson of humility learned by Nebuchadnezzar was forgotten by his successors, culminating in the fateful night described in Daniel chapter 5, where King Belshazzar decided to give a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, accompanied by much wine and irreverence. The city of Babylon was besieged by the armies of the Medo-Persia, led by Cyrus and Darius, but within the impenetrable walls, the Babylonian elite laughed at the danger, trusting in their food supplies that would last for years, and in the waters of the Euphrates River that protected the city like a natural moat. Belshazzar, in an act of supreme defiance and spiritual stupidity, ordered the golden and silver vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought, so that he, his nobles, his wives, and his concubines could drink from them. They used the sacred cups consecrated to the Lord of hosts to toast the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, mixing the sacred with the profane in a way that crossed the line of divine patience. The atmosphere of the feast was one of euphoria and blasphemy, a celebration of Babylonian invincibility and a direct mockery of the God of the captive Hebrews, as if they were saying that their idols were stronger than the Creator. Suddenly laughter ceased and the music stopped, replaced by a silence of absolute terror, when at that very moment fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the palace wall. The king saw the part of the hand that wrote, and his countenance changed. His thoughts troubled him. The joints of his hips were loosed, and his knees struck one against the other, a physical description of pure terror in the presence of the supernatural. The feast ended not with a speech, but with a judgment written on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. None of the astrologers or soothsayers could read or interpret the writing, for the message of God is foolishness to the world and can only be discerned by those who have the Spirit. It was then that the Queen Mother remembered Daniel, the man in whom was the spirit of the holy gods, who was brought into the presence of the terrified king. Daniel did not use flattery. He refused the gifts and went straight to the point, rebuking Belshazzar for not having humbled his heart, even knowing all that had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and for having risen against the Lord of heaven. The interpretation was a decree of death for the empire. God has counted your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And it is here that the story reaches its brutal and historic climax. That very night, while the palace was in panic with the divine sentence, the prophecy was being fulfilled outside in a way that no one expected. Cyrus's engineers had diverted the course of the Euphrates River, lowering the water level enough for his soldiers to march through the dry riverbed, passing under the gigantic walls and entering the city without encountering resistance, because the inner gates had been left open through carelessness or treachery. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, fell without a great battle, taken by surprise while its leaders were drunk and terrified by the finger of God. Belshazzar was killed that very night, and the empire that seemed eternal crumbled in a few hours, transferring the scepter of the world into the hands of the Persians, exactly as Jeremiah and Isaiah had prophesied decades and even centuries before. The fall of the Babylonian gods was total. Marduk could not save his king, and the walls could not stop the fulfillment of the word of God. It was the end of 70 years of Chaldean hegemony and the beginning of a new era, proving that the history of nations is not written by chance, but guided by the sovereign hand of God, who raises up kings and brings down kings to fulfill his eternal purposes and prepare the way for the liberation of his people. When the gates of Babylon opened for the conqueror Cyrus the Great, the world held its breath awaiting yet another bloody tyrant, but what happened was the fulfillment of one of the most extraordinary and specific prophecies in all of the Bible, written almost 200 years before Cyrus himself was born. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 44 verse 28 and in chapter 45 verse 1 called this Persian king by name, describing him as the anointed of the Lord, and the shepherd who would say to Jerusalem, "You shall be built," and to the temple, "Your foundation shall be laid." It is chilling to think that while the Jews wept in exile, God had already written the name of the liberator in the sacred scrolls long before Nebuchadnezzar even dreamed of invading Judah. Cyrus was not a worshipper of Jehovah. He served the Persian gods, but the heart of the king is like rivers of water in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he wishes. In the first year of his reign, the spirit of Cyrus was stirred not by a common political strategy, but by a divine restlessness, leading him to make a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom, declaring that the Lord, the God of heaven, had given him all the kingdoms of the earth, and had commissioned him to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. This changed everything. The foreign policy of the new global superpower was being dictated by God's agenda for his people, turning the greatest empire of the time into an instrument of blessing for the small nation of Israel. The decree of Cyrus, recorded in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, was a complete reversal of Babylonian policy of deportation and cultural destruction. For instead of crushing national identities, the Persians sought loyalty through religious tolerance and support for the reconstruction of local sanctuaries. But for the Jews, this was much more than administrative cleverness. It was the sound of freedom, ringing like trumpets after decades of silence and oppression. The king not only allowed them to go up to Jerusalem, but called on the inhabitants of the places where the Jews had settled to help them with silver, gold, goods, and cattle, as well as free will offerings for the house of God. It was a new exodus, but this time, instead of fleeing by night, they went out with royal seal and escort, funded by the treasures of the empire that had conquered them. And then, in the temple. A discovery changes everything in the perspective of honor. Cyrus ordered the utensils of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had brought from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods to be brought out. Those very cups that Belshazzar had profaned on his last night of life. In returning these sacred objects, 5,400 utensils of gold and silver, Cyrus was, unknowingly, restoring the dignity of Levitical worship and acknowledging that the plunder of Babylon was a mistake that needed to be corrected, showing that God takes care of the details and that what was stolen by the enemy would be returned with honor. The reaction of the people to this decree was like that of someone waking from a deep and beautiful dream, as described in Psalm 126, where the mouth was filled with laughter and the tongue with singing, for the Lord had done great things for us. The sensation of surrealism overtook the families born in captivity, who only knew Jerusalem through their grandparents' stories. Now the door was open for them to see the promised land with their own eyes. However, freedom brought with it a difficult choice: to leave the comfort and stability gained in Babylon to face a perilous journey and rebuild a ruined city. God was sifting the people once again, calling not the complacent but the volunteers of spirit, those whose hearts God had stirred to ascend. The miracle of Cyrus was not just the signing of a paper, but the compelling proof that universal history is the stage where God acts out the redemption of his elect, and that no matter how strong the captivity or how impossible the situation may seem, when God's clock strikes the hour of liberation, he moves heavens, earth, and pagan kings to fulfill his word. The caravan that departed from Babylon towards Judah numbered just under 50,000 people, a modest number considering the multitude that had been taken and multiplied in the land of exile, which reveals that many preferred the convenience of the strange land to the challenge of the promised land. The journey back was marked by a mixture of expectation and fear, retracing the path of pain from 70 years ago, but now with faces turned toward the rising sun of hope. Upon reaching the outskirts of Jerusalem, the visual impact was devastating, a punch to the stomach that no account could have prepared. The city that was the joy of all the earth had been reduced to piles of overturned stones with collapsed walls and burned gates that were now just black holes in the landscape. The weeds had grown everywhere, wild animals nested where once kings governed, and the silence of desolation was broken only by the howling wind among the ruins. As we read in Ezra chapters 2 and 3, the shock of reality was brutal. They were not returning to a ready-made home, but to a construction site abandoned for decades, where each stone would need to be moved with the sweat of their brows and the strength of their arms weakened by the journey. But the spirit of that remnant was different. They did not begin by building their own houses, but immediately focused on the altar of the God of Israel, for they understood the lesson of captivity. Without the presence of God at the center, no city can endure. In the 7th month, all the people gathered as one man in Jerusalem, and under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, they raised the altar on its bases, even though they were afraid of the peoples of the neighboring lands, and they resumed the daily sacrifices that had ceased 70 years earlier. The smoke rising again from Mount Moriah was the sign that the covenant was being renewed and the spiritual life of the nation was pulsing again. In the 2nd year of their arrival, they laid the foundations of the new temple, and it was at that moment that the scene described in Ezra chapter 3 verses 12 and 13 captured the wounded and healed soul of that generation. As the stonemasons laid the stones, the priests adorned with trumpets and the Levites with cymbals praised the Lord, singing that he is good and that his mercy endures forever toward Israel, and the people rejoiced with great joy. But then the unexpected happened, a confused sound that mixed the greatest joy with the deepest sorrow. Many of the priests, Levites, and chiefs of the fathers, who were old and had seen the glory of the first temple of Solomon, wept aloud in front of those modest foundations. The comparison was inevitable and painful. The new temple seemed insignificant compared to the memory of the gold and majesty of the former one, and this contrast broke the hearts of the elders. The noise was such that one could not distinguish the voices of joy from the voices of weeping, for the people rejoiced so loudly that the sound was heard from far away. That weeping was not one of ingratitude, but of nostalgia and recognition of how much they had lost because of sin. It was the pain of a scar that even when healed still remembers the wound. God was teaching that restoration is real, but the consequences of the past leave marks, and that the glory of the second house would not depend on gold or silver, as Haggai would later prophesy, but on the presence of the desired of all nations. The return was bittersweet because redemption in the land always carries the memory of the fall, mixing praise for the new chance with tears for what is gone, preparing the heart for a hope that is not based on buildings, but on the God who dwells with man. The 70 years of weeping in Babylon were not a mere interval in Israel's history, but a furnace of transformation that forever changed the spiritual DNA of the Jewish people. The greatest victory achieved in exile was not the geographic return, but the definitive healing of idolatry. Never again, in all its subsequent history, would the nation of Israel bow down before images of sculpture or pagan gods like Baal or Astarte. The fire of judgment cauterized this malignant wound that had tormented the people since the days of the judges, and Babylon, ironically the land of idols, became the place where Israel learned to hate idols. Furthermore, the absence of the temple gave birth to the synagogue and the focus on the study of the Torah, creating a people of the book, able to keep their faith alive anywhere in the world, without solely depending on animal sacrifices, but offering the sacrifice of lips and obedience. This new religious structure prepared the way for the dissemination of the scriptures and created the environment where, centuries later, the gospel would be preached, beginning in the synagogues spread across the nations. God used the worst moment in their history to forge the tools that would be used in the expansion of his kingdom, showing that he does not waste suffering, but recycles it into eternal purpose. During this time of reflection and waiting, Messianic hope intensified and gained sharper contours, especially through the revelations given to the prophet Daniel, such as the prophecy of 70 weeks recorded in chapter 9. The people began to understand that the true captivity was not merely submission to foreign kings, but slavery to sin, and that true liberation would not come by a military leader who would expel the Persians or Romans, but by an anointed one who would put an end to transgression and bring eternal justice. The end of the Babylonian captivity was just a shadow of a greater liberation that was to come. They returned to the land, but still awaited the king, living in the tension of a promise that pointed to a new covenant, where the law would not be written on tablets of stone, but on hearts of flesh, as Jeremiah 31 had prophesied. The experience of Babylon taught that God is faithful both in his threats and in his promises. If he fulfilled 70 years of punishment to the letter, he would certainly fulfill the promise of the coming of the Messiah with the same precision. Today, as we look at this epic saga of fall and restoration, we are confronted with the same eternal lesson. There is no place so far that the grace of God cannot reach, and there is no ruin so great that he cannot rebuild. Babylon represents the systems of the world that seek to seduce and decharacterize us, but it also represents the place of discipline where God often takes us to deal with our pride and realign our priorities. The call to come out of Babylon echoes even to the last book of the Bible, inviting us to live as pilgrims who, although in the world, do not belong to it, keeping our eyes fixed on the heavenly Jerusalem. The story does not end with the people living in rebuilt ruins, but points to the glorious future where God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, nor pain. The captivity is over, the lesson has been given, and the invitation remains open for all who, weary of their own prisons, wish to embark on the journey back to the Father's house, where true freedom awaits them with open arms. This journey shows us that the silence of God is not absence, but preparation. Strengthen your walk with us by clicking subscribe to not miss the upcoming deep studies, and share your wisdom in the comments. What would you say to someone who is waiting for an answer from God today? Your word may be exactly the comfort someone needs to read right now.